Let's take a look at body cavities. So we've got various structures of the body that will house our organs, and sometimes when I say organs, I may also use the word viscera. So just know that I use that interchangeably. Viscera meaning organs, organs meaning viscera. So we've got these cavities, these hollowed out areas of the body that will house the various viscera, organs, of the body. And it's important because it keeps them contained, but it also helps protect them as well, because as you're going to see, some of these cavities have bony structures that surround them for protection. Now, generally speaking, you can divide all the cavities of the body into those of the dorsal body cavities and the ventral body cavities. So dorsal meaning towards the back, ventral meaning towards the front or towards the belly. So the dorsal body cavities, there's two types that you need to know. All right. So what are these two types? First of which is you've got the cranial cavity. And it's unsurprising what is going to be sitting in the cranial cavity, but it's going to be housing our brain. And it's surrounded by the skull, which is a thick, bony structure which protects the underlying material of the brain, which is very delicate and gooey and basically the consistency of oatmeal. So you don't want this smashing about all over the place, damaging itself. So you need to have that strong cranial vault protecting it. Then you've got the vertebral cavity. And the vertebral cavity houses an extension of the brain, which is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord will move its way, snake its way all the way through this cavity, and it's surrounded by the bony structures of the vertebral column. So again, protecting that underlying precious structures of the nervous system. Then when we look at those of the ventral body cavities, we've got the thoracic cavity. And the thoracic cavity houses the lungs and some of the structures associated with the lungs, the heart and some of the structures associated with the heart, such as the great vessels. Then we've got the abdominal cavity, which we can see here. Abdominal cavity. And that houses mostly digestive viscera, but we also have our kidneys in there as well. It sort of sits a little bit towards the back, those kidneys, but anyway, it houses mainly digestive, but also that of renal. And then finally, we've got the pelvic cavity. And the pelvic cavity will house structures associated with the renal system and also some of the reproductive system as well. All right, let's have a look at this from an anterior or front-on view. So here we've got, again, let's just highlight the thoracic cavity. So we're looking at the ventral cavities here. So we've got the thoracic here, and we've got the abdominal here, and we've got the pelvic here. Let's just focus on the thoracic because you can see there's some subdivisions associated with the thoracic we haven't spoken about. So one of the subdivisions is that of the cavity that houses the two lungs. This is termed the pleural cavity. So we've got the pleural cavity that houses our lungs. We've also got the cavity that houses our heart. And this is termed the peri, so think of your prefixes, peri means around, cardial cavity, also known as the pericardial sac, so around the heart sac or around the heart cavity. Now you may be asking, what is this particular structure up here? And this houses some of the great vessels, blood vessels associated with the heart. And together with the cavity of the heart and that houses the vessels, we term this the mediastinum. Mediastinum or mediastinum, and it sits right in the middle, media, middle, right? Sternum referring to the sternum associated with the chest. Now what I want to talk about is that of what we call the abdominal pelvic regions. So if we were to ignore the thoracic cavity right now, and have a look and see, well, there's this structure right here that you can faintly see, which is termed the diaphragm. This is muscle that separates out. You can see this muscle separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. And this is going to be the very top of something that we call the abdominal pelvic cavity. So we can refer to these two together, and I want to have a look at the various structures that sit inside. So importantly, when we have a look at what we call the abdominal pelvic cavity, we break it up into 9 regions. And these regions are relatively arbitrary, but they help us identify where structures sit, because from a first glance, it can be quite messy inside of this abdominal pelvic region. So first of all, a couple of things. When we look at the abdominal pelvic regions, we draw a line, we draw a line, we draw a line, and we draw a line. And these are the 9 regions that we're looking at. So first, I want to label what they're called. This top one here is known as the epigastric. That's the epigastric region. Then you've got the left and right. Remember, it's the patient's left and the patient's right. Hypochondriac. Hypochondriac. And same over here. Hypochondriac. Now let's talk about these 3 areas. Firstly, epigastric. What's epi mean? Epi means upon. Gastric means stomach. So this is the area that's upon the stomach. That gives you a nice clue as to what might be sitting within this particular region. Then we've got the left and right, hypochondriac. Hypo means below. Chondriac, in this case, is referring to ribs. Okay? So we've got hypochondriac below the ribs. If I were to draw up the rib cage, on this image here, you're going to have various ribs coming down, and you're going to have ribs that go across like this, right? Now there's 12 ribs, I'm not drawing them all up, but they go across like that. So the hypochondriac means below the ribs. So you can probably guess where this region's going to be sitting. If we go right to the middle, this is the umbilical region. So you might know where this is sitting. I wonder where the umbilical cord used to be, the umbilicus. And then we've got the left and right lumbar regions. So this is referring to the area associated with the back, right? The lumbar region, so the lower portion of the back. Then we've got hypogastric. So I told you what hypo means, and gastric. So it means below the stomach. And then we've got the left and right iliac regions. Sometimes you'll see it in textbooks known as inguinal regions. But iliac here is referring to the hip bone. So maybe again you know where this is sitting. So now we've got an idea of the names, which you do need to know. We now need to place this onto the image here and then draw in the various organs. So there's a way of doing this. If we use this image to the left, there's a way of drawing these structures up, an easier way to know. So first of which, you need to find the clavicle. So the clavicle is that collarbone. And you need to find the mid-clavicular region. So find the clavicle, go right in the middle. So right there. And you can see the outline of the clavicle here, right? So mid-clavicular. And you need to draw a line to mid-inguinal. So take this line and go all the way down mid-inguinal. Take that line, go all the way down mid-inguinal. All right, we've done our first 2 vertical lines. Now, the horizontal lines. Where do these horizontal lines go? Well, we need to find the 9th rib. So I haven't drawn up all 12 ribs, but we need to find the 9th rib, and we go across from 9th rib to 9th rib. And then we find the hip bone, which is going to be around about here and here, and we go from hip bone to hip bone. And so now we've drawn in our 9 abdominopelvic regions. Let's now transfer this across to the image on the right. So I've got those 2. That there. And that there. Now let's draw in our structures. So what's going to be sitting within each of these regions? So let's go from top to bottom. First of which, let's have a look and see where the liver sits. So the liver is going to be sitting like this. This is the liver. This whole region here. So you've got, I'll draw a proper outline for it. Here's the liver. So what regions does the liver sit within? Well, the liver sits within the right hypochondriac, so this is this area here, but it also sits within the epigastric region, which is this area here. And actually, some of it can go across to the left hypochondriac as well. Now, here's the thing. These lines are arbitrary, right? They're arbitrary. So and depending on somebody's age, their sex, their position, their breathing, these organs shift, okay? So you don't have to be defined, but we can say confidently that most of the liver sits in the right hypochondriac and epigastric region. Then we're gonna have the stomach. So let's have a look at the stomach. First thing is, the esophagus of the stomach actually moves through the diaphragm, and it's behind the liver and shifts a little bit to the side, and then you got the stomach like this. And then you've got part of what's called the duodenum, the very first part of the small intestines. So here we've got the stomach. So the stomach sits where? Epigastric, upon the stomach, so that makes sense. A couple of other structures that we can draw in up the top before we move down is we can look at the spleen. So the spleen is really important when it comes to recycling dead red blood cells, and that sits a little bit behind the stomach over to this side. So it sits predominantly in the left hypochondriac region. And we've also got the pancreas too. And the pancreas actually sits, I'll use another color. Pancreas actually sits in this flexure of the duodenum and actually moves back, and the tail of the pancreas actually articulates in with that of the spleen. So here's the pancreas. So you can see the pancreas sits in the umbilical region, but also up in the epigastric and also heading towards the left hypochondriac. Now, the small intestines. The stomach moves its way into the small intestines, or turns into the small intestines, and most of the small intestines is going to be sitting here in the umbilical region. This is where the small intestines reside. Now, the small intestines actually finish around about over here, and then they turn into the first part of the large intestines, like that. Now, I don't like that color, so let's change it. Let's go to blue. So, small intestines finish and turn into large intestines. Now, a couple of things. What we've got here is the appendix. So the appendix for most people sit in the right iliac region, but for some it's also sitting in the hypogastric region. So it can shift around a little bit. And then the very last part of the small intestines turns into the large intestines, and that starts to move its way up. So this is the ascending colon of the large intestines. Then it moves across, and this is the transverse colon. You see it's right at the upper border of the umbilical region. And then what you can see is it moves into the left lumbar region and descends down. Then it turns into the sigmoid colon, which goes through a couple of different areas, and then the rectum, which is in the hypogastric, and then the anus. So what we can see is a whole bunch of various structures and where they sit within these 9 regions of the abdominal and pelvic cavity. And so hopefully this gives you a nice introduction to the various cavities of the body, but also some of the structures that sit within the cavities of the body.